If you look at the radio markets which have done the best, all have their own lobbying and information organization.
The idea is to be able to subscribe to it anywhere, and that whole everywhere you get your podcasts, it means something.
I don't necessarily mind how someone listens to my show, as long as they listen.
Yeah.
And if they think it's a podcast, but they happen to be having a listen on the YouTube platform, well, great. I don't mind.
Thank you for joining me again on Tales of the Trade. I'm Chirag Desai. In the chapters today...
Hello, I'm James Cridland, the editor of Pod News. And later, I'll be talking about what's happening in the podcast landscape and some thoughts about the future.
This is the second part of my conversation with James Cridland. On part 1, I spoke to James about the origin story of Pod News and how it's not just the place to get your podcasting news, but a platform that powers reporting on the industry. You'll find that episode right before this one in your podcast app, so do check it out if you haven't already. For this episode, we're talking about the podcast industry itself, where it stands today, and our thoughts on some of the shifts we're seeing in the space. But before we do that, if you're interested in the history of podcasts, tracing back to the early 2000s, there's an excellent episode of the Vergecast from a few weeks ago to check out. You'll hear some of the veterans of the industry, including podfather Adam Curry, Dave Weiner, and James himself. There's a link in our show notes. It's really a great slice of podcast history. If I look back at the last couple of years, I feel like the conversation around podcasting seems to be at one extreme or another extreme, essentially, right? So we had a lot of conversations of, that's it, it's over, Spotify's out, everybody's out, or the money's gone, everything. And it was just like that. And then suddenly one person makes an investment in one show and it's like, podcasting's back, everything's hunky-dory. And so I think obviously as someone that prefers nuance, I think we're somewhere a little bit closer to the center than we are at any of those extremes, right? My one note there also is I feel like, for a while, Spotify has been the dominator of the conversation in terms of where things are. To their credit, it's because, they made some very, very strategic acquisitions in 2018 and 19 that suddenly made everybody look at podcasting and almost mainstreamed it because they were like, well, if Spotify is spending so much money, maybe there's something in this sector, right? But, something as simple as... them not renewing some of these exclusive shows that they did started spelling the doom and gloom. And I'm like, no, at least most of us kind of figured that when the contracts were up for renewal, they weren't going to get renewed. Like, it's not so surprising, especially when for many of those shows, there was no content produced anyway, right? Yeah. So I think that if I take out those pieces, then I feel like we're probably somewhere maybe in the middle. So I want to get maybe, first of all, an overall sense from you in terms of, let's do a lay of the land and then we'll take it on certain specific points.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We've definitely seen a bubble, and that bubble has, it hasn't burst, but it is deflated.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
And I think that is, there is a wider conversation around Hollywood as a whole is not having a great time of it right now. And the whole streaming model has changed, and that has meant that that there is a lot of money which is leaving Hollywood, and podcasting has not been immune to that.
Yeah.
And I think it is interesting when you look at the US. Everybody assumes that the US means the entire industry, which of course it doesn't. And we see so much growth in Europe, here in the Arab states as well. So much growth of podcasting right now.
In India as well, for example.
I mean, India doing fantastically. I mean, I was, I helped program the Podcast Day Asia conference about a month or so ago. And again, the stories coming out of the Philippines, coming out of Indonesia about the growth of podcasting in those markets is massive. There's some tremendous things going on. So I think we've looked too much at the US. We've assumed that everything that the US does is, if the US catches a cold, if the US, has a sniffly nose, then the rest of us catches a cold, or whatever that phrase is. But you know what I mean?
Oh dear.
I think it's something that, we just need to be a little bit more aware that there is, that there are different markets, and those markets are moving in different times as well. And so we're certainly seeing significant growth in Europe, significant growth here in the Arab world. And that to me is very exciting because it means that it's less about Radiolab and less about the New York Times and more
NPR
about
and,
everybody's voice and conversations from across the world. And I think that that's a very exciting thing.
We've always said this in this region, more so for things like tech and even entrepreneurship and that kind of stuff, right? Is there's a bit of a lag between, things sort of taking off in the US and then it kind of actually becoming a thing here. Sometimes that lag is 5 years or slightly less now with the connectivity we have. But we have then the luxury of like learning from some of those lessons, right? And we have the opportunity to say, well, at the time it looked like a good idea, but it didn't really work out, and so maybe we don't go down those paths. So I think that's not necessarily a bad thing in that way.
And by the way, I think that there are two different industries here. There's podcasting, the idea of making shows and releasing them and all of that, and then there's the podcast monetization part, or as Adam Curry, the man who invented podcasting, he calls it the podcast industrial complex. I think he's being slightly negative towards it. But they are two very different parts of the industry. Yeah. And as one increases, that doesn't necessarily mean that the other one increases. As making money, it's still very much a US thing in terms of podcasting. If you look, and we did some work with Will Page, who used to be Spotify's chief economist, knows a thing or two about the economy of the content world. And he worked out that podcasting, for example, in the UK was earning about 20% of what it should be if it was earning the same amount of money as the US market. Australia about a third, interestingly. So I think that there are two parallel things going on here. There's the content creation stuff, and then there's the ad sales, and then of course you've got in the middle, as you'll be very aware of, is the whole branded podcast world, which doesn't have to rely on advertising,
correct?
But still has to rely on companies that are interested enough to bankroll some of those shows
and long term,
and so you've got that sort of interesting mix. What excites me, I think, about podcasting, the content creation side now, is that, for example, if your primary language is Arabic, you don't now have to learn English in order to host a podcast on a podcast host, because there are now some podcast hosting companies that have a background and a back end in the Arabic language. That's a tremendous step forward, and we kind of forget how important just getting the simple building blocks are. And something that there are so many companies out there that are so focused on the English speaking world that actually they're missing so many opportunities.
As someone that obviously not only follows Pod News but also follows Podcasting 2.0 and does read Ashley Carmen's pieces in the Bloomberg and so on, it's to me it's pretty evident that there is a whole wave of podcasting that continues to be growing, and doesn't really care about the whether someone opines or doesn't opine that the industry is going a certain place or it isn't, right? And I think that's wonderful. And I think that's one of the strengths of podcasting, being the kind of open space that it always has been. And was it last year or the year before, on a panel here, I was asked that question, like, what do you think is the best feature of podcasting? And I said, it's the openness, right? Anybody can start in podcasting. Today, the on-ramp is negligible in terms of cost to get started. But also the fact that you can own your content, you can own your feed, you can put it up where you want to, you can make decisions whether you want it to be on one platform or another. It doesn't in today's world, that may not sound like big things, because it's like, well, whatever, I'm going to put it everywhere, right? But actually having that control of your content is actually a very powerful thing, and actually very few mediums still let you do that, right? So you can be a splendid content creator on Instagram or TikTok, but ultimately you are at the mercy of that platform, right? Yeah. And I think that is inherently one of the most powerful things of podcasting, but one of the most difficult things to understand for most people, because today it's very normalized that content means Instagram and certain platforms that are not, that are proprietary. But subsequently also, it's a struggle with the podcast industrial complex with advertisers and others who want more out of it, that they're, to some degree, I agree with Adam Curry and others who say you're not going to get it, because one is the critical mass of it is so large that you're not going to change that. And I think that there's enough in the podcasting space today that doesn't want to go down that route, because we've seen it already everywhere else and realized that getting that level of data, the privacy concerns aside, doesn't actually result in good content anyway. And so you might as well focus on, growing that audience largely. So I think the rest of us can see this growing, and it's growing at its own pace. And sure, there are little downturns here and there, and we see those trends kind of reflected, right?
Absolutely. And I think the ad market in particular is very different in different markets.
Absolutely.
My favorite thing about living in Australia is that listening to a lot of the shows that I listen to, they will say, or you will hear things like, we'll be back after this short break.
And
then there's a beat pause, and then it's a welcome back.
Yep.
And because someone hasn't been able to sell the advertising, or somebody hasn't probably cared to sell the advertising in the Australian market. And so, look, at the end of the day, it's 90% plus of all podcasts out there do not have advertising in them.
No.
And they pay their way doing other things, and they may pay their way in terms of getting more visibility for the person that does that particular podcast. It may pay their way just simply because if you're running an interview podcast, maybe you're running an interview podcast about the cheese business. You will interview all of the big cheeses in cheese. I wish I hadn't gone.
Wow, yeah. So that's a good metaphor. I mean, we can keep going.
That then means that you, being involved in that industry, have a time
Unlocks
to
the stuff
sit
for you.
down with people. There's tremendous opportunities.
Absolutely.
And actually, it kind of doesn't matter if no one listens. I mean, it does, but it kind of doesn't for that podcast to pay its own way.
Correct.
So there are lots of different ways. And I think if we're not careful, we focus on the ad side because it's a very easy side to focus on. It's a very visible side to focus on. But actually, there are so many other things. There was a story that I linked to not so long ago about someone who had been creating a podcast about air conditioning units, and he has ended up making hundreds of thousands of dollars from this show. Because he has a very small audience, but it's an audience who are really into installing air conditioners. He's understood that these people are traveling from job to job to job. He's made the podcast episodes, the average duration of a trip from one job to another.
Right.
So you can actually have a listen in one go. And that is a perfect example of why podcasting isn't radio, because that would never work on the air.
It's mass versus niche, right?
It works, but it works absolutely fine as a podcast. And that is great.
My favorite example is something called The Pen Addict, which is a show about pens. Right. And I think that's the thing that we try to keep telling podcasters, and especially when we talk to them, is find the space that you're passionate about, like build your content around that, and then do the rest. Because for some people, like you said, the podcast is a means to something else, or is an add-on to something else that they're doing, whether we'll call it thought leadership around topics and that kind of thing. Like you said, it gives you entry into certain markets. It can be, it doesn't necessarily always have to be something that this needs to make money or it's done.
Yeah, or it needs millions of downloads a month.
Exactly.
None of that is as important as actually super serving the audience that you want to serve, and making their life easier or fixing a problem.
I call that the listening experience, which is a good segue into talking about video. I was talking to Ramsey from South on a previous episode, and we kind of reached a similar conclusion where there's this heavy conversation on video that's been going on for the last couple of years. I think it has taken its own little add-on with YouTube coming into the picture. Our take was, this is not really the conversation. It's not whether audio wins or video wins. It's about what's right for your show and can it work. And my favorite joke on this is, on YouTube, if you can see the mics, it's a podcast. If you can't see the mics, it's not a podcast, right? Like that's how it's become today. As someone who has always been a bit of a podcast purist, to say that a podcast is an audio content in an RSS feed. I've bended on the first half of that definition because I think it's perfectly fine if someone wants to do video. And, we're doing more video today anyway as a result of various things. I still don't feel like relenting on the RSS feed part of it, because I think that the idea is to be able to subscribe to it anywhere. And, that whole everywhere you get your podcasts, it means something. What do you think is sort of this future of this audio versus video conversation? But then let's talk a little bit about YouTube specifically.
Yeah, I think the definition of a podcast is a piece of audio first content rather than audio content. So it's content that you can listen to while your eyes are busy. Now, it may have some visual accompaniment, sure, because everything that we listen to audio on these days has a screen. That never used to be the case.
That's true.
But everything that we listen to audio on now has a full color screen that's capable of video. But the benefit of podcasting is that you can listen while you're driving a car. You can listen while you're operating heavy machinery.
Or doing dishes, which is my favorite place to do it.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Or cooking.
Yeah.
Or any of those things, or walking the dog, or any of those things where watching something is much harder. And it reminds me of, I worked for the BBC for a couple of years, and we ended up putting live streaming the output of one of our top 40 radio shows at breakfast. And the presenter who was on that show, the announcer, the RJ, he just started looking at the cameras and playing up to the cameras and showing things to the cameras. And the radio show ended up being total garbage because he was focusing too much on the minuscule amount of people that were streaming his show online instead of the millions, literally millions of people that were having a listen to him on the FM. And so I think we just need to be very careful that actually the thing that makes podcasting so great is that it is audio first.
Right.
So, that's kind of one side. I think the other side in terms of RSS is probably a slightly different conversation, but I think making it available to as many people as possible on whatever platform they want to have listened to is an important part of that. YouTube uses RSS under the hood if you want it to. So it's a great way of getting shows into YouTube. You can't get video in that way, but you can get the audio in that way, and that's all fine. At the end of the day, I don't necessarily mind how someone listens to my show as long as they listen.
Yeah.
And if they think it's a podcast, then, but they happen to be having a listen on the YouTube platform, well, great. I don't mind.
When YouTube enabled the RSS integration, we just imported everything into YouTube. So it's fine. Like, let's just do it. Now, and we actually found that we had a couple of audio episodes just take off. And since then, obviously, now we're a little bit more embedded in the YouTube ecosystem as a result of this, including with video. But the more conversations I have, a lot of people say that, right? They listen to podcasts on YouTube, but not necessarily watch it, right? So they leave it on in the background while they're working or doing something else. As we say, like in the letter and the spirit, it's in the spirit of the podcast sort of, content ecosystem that is how, that's totally fine with the way, if people are listening that way.
Something for your ears when your eyes are busy.
Yeah. Is a good way to,
Yeah.
Which also leads me to a little bit of the other point. I think we spend to some degree too much time just talking to other podcasters and getting caught in that bubble.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there's anything wrong with talking to other podcasts. I think it's wonderful, right? And I think it's great that we get to connect with each other. But I think we forget sometimes that our listeners are sitting outside that bubble. And they're doing things that are very different to the way we might do things. And I feel like we're still sometimes caught in that to say, like, if we talk to enough podcasters, this will change. And it potentially won't, because the listeners are doing their behavior, outside that bubble.
Yeah. And I think that's something that you get very much from the radio side, is focusing on the audience all the time.
Yeah.
What does the audience want? How are they listening? How can you make things easier for them? And and so I've always come at that at the industry from that point of view. And I think yes, you're right. We do need to focus more on you're not going to get more listeners from a podcast conference from attending a podcast conference. You might get ideas on how to get more listeners, but none of the people attending that podcast conference are going to listen to your show. Sorry, but that's not how it works.
Yeah, or if it is, it's like a 0.1%, so somebody
exactly.
actually finds your show interesting,
Exactly.
but that's different.
And it's why I do an occasional series, which is podcast advertising in the wild, because
I do.
I believe very strongly that we should be advertising podcasts on things that are not podcast apps.
Yeah. 100%.
Because if we're just focusing on getting into new and noteworthy on Apple Podcasts, well, that's not very helpful for the large amount of people that aren't listening enough to a podcast, maybe don't even know that a podcast app exists on their phone.
Yeah.
And so actually, being advertising on billboards or advertising, making it really clear that it's a podcast and what a podcast is, but advertising, in magazines, advertising wherever your potential audience is.
We have someone who's done it on the lid of something they sell in their restaurant. There's a QR code at the top of it to say, by the way, you can listen to a show that we do on the side. Because, the number of people who don't listen to podcasts is far, far larger than the people who listen to podcasts. And I think we forget that all the time.
Yes. Although actually in Australia, I think 51% of the
some countries may be true.
Tune in. But no, you're absolutely right. And so I do think that we need to, there are things that I talk about around making it easy for people. And one of those things is making sure that, for example, the button on your website is the standard Apple Podcast button and the standard Spotify button, because people recognize those and at least they understand what they do. So make sure that you do that sort of thing. Don't use the word podcast on your podcast, because you're making it much harder to find anywhere. But do use the word podcast when it isn't a podcast, if you see what I mean. When you're advertising something on the side of a sauce jar, then make sure that it says the word podcast all over there, because otherwise no one will know. So it's all of those things, just to make sure that it's really clear and obvious what's going on.
Let's touch a little bit on the open side of podcasting, maybe specifically on podcasting 2.0, but we can keep it a bit broad. For me, it has and it continues to be fascinating, the work that they're doing in terms of sort of taking back control of the core, the RSS and the directory and all of that. And as much as I get that, for me, it's about the innovation behind it, right? I think RSS has been stagnant for a while. We can all see why it's helpful to have creator defined transcripts in the feed, right? And other things like location. And there are a lot of other, I think, powerful things that actually are valuable to listeners. And I think this is, again, where we get caught up in that a little bit, where we're talking about, podcasters want this. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's fine. Of course we should want stuff too. But is it actually useful at the other end is something that it should pass the filter of. And I think something like, location's a good example. Transcripts are a great example of where it's actually beneficial on the other side. And therefore you see adoption happen so much faster. It's so much easier to explain versus very techie, geeky stuff that while are a great addition to the RSS feed, see the kind of adoption they do and so on.
So, I mean, taking a step back, when I wrote my first RSS feed, there weren't images in there, if you can imagine such a thing. So no podcasts came with any thumbnail images. And one of the changes that Apple made when they jumped into this world is that they went, well, actually, we need categories, because there aren't any categories, and we need thumbnail images, and they should be this size, please, and thank you very much.
Right.
And so Apple did a great job right at the early doors of the podcasting industry, in that they jumped in and they said, we will add a ton of these additional features to make podcasting look as good as possible on our devices.
And I'd argue also standardizing that feed, because I think that, because everybody had to support Apple Podcasts, everybody just subscribed to that feed, and then that made things easier up to a point. Yeah,
indeed. And so I think what the thinking was behind, so podcasting 2.0 was really kind of not quite put together by Adam Curry and Dave Jones, who've been working on this, but I think they were asked by a number of people, now we've got an alternative index rather than just the Apple Podcasts index. Can we also think about how to make podcasting better? And can you help us with that? And I'm not sure that either Adam or Dave initially signed up to do that kind of work, but it's been super helpful to have people who have been driving that work and making sure that that works, as well as we can possibly.
Yeah, at least there's a cycle and there's releases and, all of that stuff, which I think for a long time was just languishing nowhere.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that there's been a lot of, there's been some very random things that haven't quite worked.
Mm-hmm.
And there've been some really good things that have worked particularly well. So, transcripts being a great example. The podcast funding tag, which more podcast apps should be supporting, but that is also another great, tag and feature that people should be using.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bunch of that kind of work. But I think it's very important that the ideas for how to make podcasting better don't just come from a few geeks. They also come from, human beings at large.
Yeah.
My point around the location tag, which hasn't really taken off as much as I hoped that it would, and I would like to do a little bit more work on that. The location tag is theoretically, what is this podcast about? Or where is this podcast about? It's not where this podcast was recorded, because actually that doesn't matter. It's what is this podcast editorially about, so that I can jump into my Tesla, I can go from A to B, and along the way, oh, look, I'm going past this place, and here's a podcast about it. That, to me, sounds like a really interesting way of discovery, of finding new shows.
Yeah.
They're about particular places, and I'm waiting for someone to do the tech work from a app point of view on how that works. Maybe if my coding was a bit better, maybe that's something that I could end up doing myself. But yeah, so I think that there's a bunch of, very, very interesting pieces of work there. Some, as I say, some of it has worked fantastically well, and some of it is, hasn't. But that's the way of any new, of any thinking of this type. Yeah.
Let's maybe look at the next couple of years, and I'd love to hear from you what you think are maybe like one or two key areas that you think us as an industry should be working on, putting away some of this noise that we've kind of debated so far,
I think one of those things is, we will always have conversations around the measurement side of podcasting, because open podcasting, where anyone can make a podcast app, is essentially incompatible with apps that spy on you, that work out exactly how long you've listened to this particular episode and report that back to some higher being somewhere.
Sure.
And so we will always have that that friction between open podcasting but we need better measurement to go out and sell ads. The newspaper industry has done pretty well over the last few hundred years by essentially making up much of its. Much of
we've
its
published these many, and we think that's how many are out there. And
we published this many, and we think that each newspaper is read by X people, so we'll just times it by that number.
Yeah.
And we've got no idea how many people get to page 20, but fine, fair enough. So I don't think that we should worry as much as we do about measurement, but things that would be useful, for example, would be for those apps that are keeping the consumption information. So when I listen, how far into the podcast I listen, where I fast forward, and all of that kind of stuff. Apple does that. Spotify does that. YouTube does that, obviously. I bet that there are a couple of other large podcast apps that do that. Wouldn't it be great to have a standard API that pulled that information and allowed all of us to consume that data? So they are consuming in an open fashion all of our RSS feeds. Can we get in a open stroke closed fashion a standard API which actually has all of that information in there? That would be a great step forward, because that way we would know what works better in terms of the stuff that we do. So I think that would be a helpful thing. I think more sort of broadly, and this again comes back to the radio world, if you look at the radio markets which have done the best in terms of audiences, in terms of ad revenue, in terms of all of that, they are markets like the UK, like Finland, like Australia, which all have their own lobbying and information organization. In the UK, it's the Radio Centre. In Australia, it's Commercial Radio and Audio. In Finland, it's Radio Media.
Right.
They are there educating the market about what radio is all about and all of radio's strengths and everything else, and educating the ad buyers and educating everybody else, and helping legislation and helping get radio in front of government and helping all kinds of this stuff. Podcasting does not have any of that.
You're right. There isn't an organization that does that. I don't think there's a non-lobbying organization that does that either effectively in the podcasting space. I'm trying to think of good of examples of where that may have started. Well, there's a couple of those where an attempt was made in that direction, but hasn't gone anywhere.
Yeah,
I don't know why that is.
No, and I think partially it's because the IAB has a lot of leadership in this field, but the IAB, also do punch the monkey ad banners.
Yeah,
I mean, they're not
a wide
there.
Organization.
They're not there for podcasting.
No.
They're there for a variety of different.
Yeah, I mean, they have a working group for podcasts,
yeah.
but or actually, it's larger for audio and podcasts in general, and then within that come the standards and all of that. Yeah,
so, and they also move very, very slowly as well, because
yes.
they move in the speed of large media broadcasters rather than the podcasting world that can be an awful lot faster. So, from my point of view, I'm just keen to see, is there something there in terms of a podcast advertising bureau, if you like, that can actually sit there and that can. Now, there are issues with doing this, particularly under a US law, but being able to put a little bit of pressure, for example, if we wanted that podcast funding tag, a little button that says support this show, and you press it and it takes you to whatever the podcaster has chosen as a
payment page,
means of whether it's payment or whether it's something, something else. If we wanted to get that into the big podcast apps, then there's no real way. There's no organization which is helping doing that, which is going to the large podcast apps and saying, we really, really want this as creators. And I think we're missing a trick of not being able to do that. And we're ceding too much control over to the likes of Apple that don't really want any change, and Spotify, who are very keen on change, but change done their
motivated,
way. Thank you very much.
Motivated for very different reasons. Which again, nothing wrong with that, but it is motivated by very different reasons. Yeah.
And so I do think, so you only have to, for example, look at again, a radio example. But the reason why DAB, which is a way of broadcasting radio that's different to AM and FM, but is still a radio receiver. DAB has been so successful in Europe, partially because the industry successfully lobbied the European Parliament to say that new cars, when you buy a new car, it has to have DAB in it. So laws were passed and everything. Another example from the UK is how lots of radio ads have always historically had to have an awful lot of small print in them. Yeah. Terms and conditions on request, ask for written details, and all this kind of nonsense. The radio industry in the UK has done a lot of work with Europe and the UK Parliament in removing the requirement for a lot of that unnecessary stuff that just gets in the way of the audience experience.
Yeah.
So, there are really good examples out there, and I wish that we would act as podcasters and as podcast creators. I wish that we would, and the podcast industry as a whole, I wish that we would work together a little bit more on some of those big things to move the industry forward. That would be my ideal.
Do you think it's a maturity thing? As in, radio has been around for hundreds of years at least in some countries. And therefore, there is enough of an evolution that eventually we've reached this stage. Not to take anything away from, podcasting, but it's a 20, 25-year-old as far as we can date it,
I think some of it is due to that. And I think, to come back to what we were saying, earlier in our conversation, only 10% of shows are actually monetized in an advertising way anyway. And so I think there is a bit of that. I think also, actually, it is harder for podcasting in general because we are a completely global media. we're there. We're not just a local broadcast market. So therefore, the people that look after us are people like Spotify and Apple, and they are also massive, great big companies, and they probably don't want to be pushed around by anyone, let alone a ragtag group of podcasters. So I think it's actually harder than radio companies or the broadcast companies, and their associations. But I do think that it's a very important thing that we actually get right. Maybe organizations like Sounds Profitable might be a part of that. Maybe there are other ways forward. The Podcast Standards Project, from my understanding, was really there as a way of trying to temper the enthusiasm and the excitement about, let's think of this new feature and let's throw it into the standard and away we go, with a more business-focused hat on of which are the features that we should be getting into as many apps and hosting companies as possible, and really just focus on those, so that we can get broad adoption of some of these things. So you can see that the being a little bit of benefit of the Podcast Standards Project in there, of a sales organization in there as well, and just working a little bit more of that sort of work.
I mean, we had. I mean, I know you're still. I think you're still part of it. But what was it called? I forget the acronym now. But the one where you've put all the user agents together and figured it. OPOG. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Yes, it was a very niche requirement, and it continues to be. And so you're satisfying that, and I think that's great. I mean, I think it's matured. I think it's also fragmentation, right? So I mean, you mentioned the Podcast Standards Project. They put out this sort of thing about the download. And for me, the problem is that the IAB has gone already defined it, charged people for it, and certifying people on that same metric. And so now, by the time this catches up with that, I don't see it happening, because right now, as we saw, right, with the moment Megaphone said, we're not doing version 2.1, there was this sort of like, oh my God, this thing is falling apart. The problem is, again, as you mentioned, for all the reasons that IAB may not be motivated necessarily to do something, but they're entrenched in the system in terms of this certification, because now it's become this demand that hosting companies do that, right? So
Spotify actually pulled out from the IAB completely, and they said, we think it's irrelevant to the business, and we're not going to be doing any of it anymore. Yeah. And it was the lobby of all of their clients who said, you're doing what now? No, you don't do that. You must at least recertify. Pull out of being a member of the IAB, that's absolutely fine, but at least recertify your platform so that it is actually certified. And I think we did that as an industry. We pushed them to get that done. There was a lot of, I think I must have used the word disappointing quite a lot of times. So I think that does show the power that we have as an industry if we just organize ourselves a little bit more. In my humble opinion, we shouldn't be leaving the important standards of the industry to an organization like the IAB, which doesn't, at the end of it, care about the podcast world. And I think it would be better for us to own that. But that's a conversation I'm sure that
I think we can have we can have more episodes about that. That was my conversation with James Cridland, editor of podnews.net, on the podcast industry. Thank you again for listening to Tales of the Trade, brought to you by Amaya Media. I'm Chirag Desai, and original music for the show was composed by Rainer Erlings. We'll be back soon.